1899, in Jewett City, Connecticut, an 11-year-old boy named Jean-Baptiste pushes a broom across the wooden floor. The mill is deafening. The thunder of looms, the hiss of steam, the shouts of foremen over the machinery. The boy sweeps slowly, deliberately, because he knows that if he sweeps well, if he finishes without drawing attention, he will be allowed to return on his day off. And on his day off, he watches a man named Joseph Labonne, a French machinist who works with tools and metal and precision. The boy's first name is Jean-Baptiste. His brothers are Jean-Baptiste. His father is Jean-Baptiste. He will come to be called John. He cannot yet speak English. He does not know that he is about to change the course of a world war that has not yet begun. This is not the story of a genius who was born knowing how to design rifles. This is the story of a poor immigrant boy who watched a machinist work and fell in love with the idea that human intelligence could solve problems through metal and geometry. This is the story of how a man from Quebec, whose first language was French, whose education ended in the 3rd grade, whose early life was marked by poverty and displacement, would eventually design a rifle so fundamentally superior to the weapons his future enemies would carry that General George Patton would call it the greatest battle implement ever devised. And this is the story of how that rifle would be manufactured in such quantities that it would arm 6 million soldiers, a number so vast that it represents a complete reversal of what any reasonable person in 1925 would have believed possible. The rifle John Garand designed was considered unmakeable. When he first submitted his designs to the United States Army Ordnance Department in 1932, the response was skeptical. Other designers had attempted to create semi-automatic rifles, weapons that would fire once with each trigger pull, rather than requiring manual operation of a bolt between shots. The technical challenges were immense. A semi-automatic rifle had to operate reliably in mud, sand, Arctic cold, and tropical humidity. It had to perform consistently whether the ammunition came from a factory in 1936 or from stores that had been sitting in warehouses since 1918. The bolt had to lock at precisely the right moment. The timing had to be exact. The tolerances were so strict that many engineers believed that mass-producing such a weapon was simply impossible. John Garand did not believe it was impossible. But his path to this belief had been anything but direct. His father had brought the family from Quebec to Connecticut in 1899, seeking work. Garand's mother had died, and the father had 12 children to support. They were poor. The textile mill was desperate for workers, and it cared nothing for age or education. Garand at 11 was old enough to work. He became a bobbin boy, sweeping floors, performing simple tasks. But something in him watched the machinists. Something in him understood that the machines themselves were problems that had been solved. That understanding became obsession. By his teens, while still at the textile mill, Garand had already filed 2 patents. Neither would make him rich. One was for a telescopic jack he designed for the tool room. The other was a machine for painting the ends of bobbins. But these patents represented something far more significant than the modest compensation they generated. They represented a mind that saw problems and solved them. At 16, Garand left the textile mill and obtained an apprenticeship at Brown & Sharp, a prestigious toolmaking and gauge manufacturing firm in Providence, Rhode Island. For the first time, he was working in an environment where precision was not an option, but a requirement. Brown & Sharp manufactured tools used in other factories. Tolerances that were measured in thousandths of an inch were standard. Garand became expert in this world of precision. He became a toolmaker and a gauge maker. He learned how metal could be bent and shaped to exact specifications. He learned that if you understood geometry and had the right equipment, and possessed the discipline to verify every measurement, you could create components so precisely identical that they would interlock without adjustment. It was this understanding, learned in the grinding precision work of a toolmaking firm, that would eventually allow him to solve the problem that other designers had deemed impossible. In 1916, Garand left Brown & Sharp and began designing firearms. The United States was not yet at war, but the nation recognized that it was moving toward conflict. Military contracts were becoming available. Garand designed a light machine gun, patenting his design in 1918. The war ended before his design could be fully evaluated, but the weapon caught the attention of military officials. In 1919, at 31 years old, Garand was offered a position as an engineer at the Springfield Armory, the government facility in Massachusetts where the United States designed and manufactured military rifles. For the first time in his life, Garand had security. He was a government employee. He would have a salary, modest but steady. More importantly, he would have access to the best machine shops and testing facilities in America. And he would have a problem to solve that would consume the remainder of his professional life. The problem was simple to state. The United States Army needed a semi-automatic rifle. During World War I, the American military had relied on the Springfield M1903, a bolt-action rifle that was powerful and accurate, but limited in fire rate. A trained soldier could fire approximately 10 to 15 aimed shots per minute. The enemy, German, Austrian, anyone who faced disciplined American infantry could do the same. The exchange of rifle fire was essentially equal when only the weapons were considered. What made the difference was tactics, leadership, discipline, and luck. But the military planners in Washington believed that there had to be a way to increase the rate of fire without sacrificing accuracy or reliability. Garand began work on the problem in 1920. He knew from his experience at Brown and Sharp that precision manufacturing was possible, but he also knew that a semi-automatic rifle would be far more complex than a bolt-action rifle. Every component would have to work perfectly. The tolerances would be tight. The manufacturing process would be challenging, but Garand believed it could be done. His first design used a primer-actuated system. When a bullet fired, the impact of the primer would generate a small amount of gas that could be used to operate the mechanism. It was an ingenious concept, using the force that was already present but usually wasted. Garand developed this design through the early 1920s. By 1925, it appeared to be working, and then the Army changed the specifications for the .30-06 cartridge. The new ammunition would not work with Garand's primer-actuated system. Garand had to start over. He designed a new system using a gas-operated mechanism. As a cartridge fired, some of the gas that propelled the bullet forward would instead be redirected through a small port in the barrel. This gas would then drive a piston that would operate the rifle's action, causing the spent casing to be extracted and a new round to be chambered. This design competed with others in Army trials. By 1929, Garand's gas-operated design had won the competition. The Army appeared ready to adopt it. And then Douglas MacArthur, the Army Chief of Staff, vetoed the decision. MacArthur insisted on various requirements that the other competing designs met, but Garand's did not. Garand returned to his workshop and modified his rifle yet again. By 1932, he had a design that satisfied MacArthur's requirements. The Army adopted it provisionally. In 1936, after years of testing and refinement, the M1 rifle, officially the U.S. rifle, caliber .30 M1, but informally known as the Garand, was officially standardized as the weapon of the United States Army. 12 years. From first concept to military adoption, 12 years had passed. During those years, Garand had faced repeatedly the kind of setback that would have broken a less determined mind. But each time, he had returned to his workshop and solved the problem that was blocking his progress. This was not genius in the conventional sense. This was persistence. This was the dedication of a man who had learned in a textile mill that if you watched carefully and thought systematically about how things worked, you could solve almost any mechanical problem. The M1 rifle that finally emerged was a marvel of precision engineering. It weighed only 9.5 pounds. It was gas-operated, but the gas system Garand had refined was elegant and reliable. The rifle was fed by an 8-round clip called an en-bloc clip. When a soldier loaded a full clip into the rifle, the spring-loaded follower inside the magazine would push the rounds up into the firing chamber one at a time. When the 8th and final round was fired, the empty clip would be automatically ejected with a distinctive pinging sound, a sound that would become iconic in American military history. The soldier could then load another clip and continue firing. The advantage of this system was that a soldier could fire 8 rounds without ever removing his hands from the rifle. Each shot required only a trigger pull. The rifle did all the mechanical work, extracting the spent casing, chambering the new round, cocking the hammer. A trained rifleman could fire 8 aimed shots in approximately 10 to 15 seconds. The rifle was semi-automatic, meaning it fired only once per trigger pull. unlike a fully automatic weapon that would continue firing as long as the trigger was held down, but for a soldier in combat. The ability to fire accurate shots without the delay required to work a bolt represented an enormous advantage over an enemy armed with bolt-action rifles. Yet the design that seemed so elegant to Garand was, from a manufacturing perspective, nearly impossible. The gas system required precise tolerances. The bolt had to lock at exactly the right moment, or the rifle would either fail to chamber a round or the pressures would be dangerous. The end-block clip system required careful engineering, so that rounds would feed reliably without jamming. American factories had never manufactured anything quite like it at the volumes the military anticipated would be needed. In 1937, the first production M1 rifles were manufactured at Springfield Armory. The initial production rate was extremely modest, a handful of rifles per day. The rifle had to be tested and retested. Early production rifles had failures. The gas system sometimes trapped too much pressure. The bolt sometimes did not lock properly. Garand, now in his late 40s, worked constantly to solve these problems. Gradually, through the late 1930s, the design was refined. By 1940, as the world moved toward war, production rates began to increase. But the biggest challenge was yet to come. The military planners in Washington understood that if the United States entered the war that was clearly approaching, they would need millions of rifles. Millions. The entire rifled weapons production of the United States in World War I had been roughly 3 million total. Now the military was planning for a force that would require 6 million rifles or more. Could American industry manufacture semi-automatic rifles, weapons so complex that many engineers believed them impossible to mass produce, in such quantities? John Garand's greatest contribution to the war effort was not the rifle itself but the manufacturing philosophy he had brought from his years at Brown and Sharp. He understood something that many other designers did not, that if you designed a rifle with the intention of mass production, if you standardized components, if you worked with manufacturers to create tolerances that could be achieved reliably by semi-skilled workers using machine tools, then you could actually manufacture millions of complex weapons. Garand worked closely with the production engineers at Springfield Armory to refine the manufacturing processes. He designed fixtures that would hold components in exactly the right position so that machine tools could produce parts with consistent precision. He worked with manufacturers like Winchester Repeating Arms to establish standardized production procedures. By 1941, when the United States entered the war, Springfield Armory was producing over 600 M1 rifles per day. Winchester was ramping up production. By 1943, at peak production, Springfield Armory alone was manufacturing 1,300 completed M1 rifles per shift. That was 164 rifles per hour, and this was just one of several manufacturing facilities. The production numbers were staggering. By the end of the war, 5.4 million M1 rifles had been manufactured, 4.1 million by Springfield Armory alone, with Winchester, International Harvester, and Harrington and Richardson contributing millions more. Every single one of these rifles was manufactured to the same tolerances, with interchangeable parts, so that a component manufactured in one factory could be used to repair a rifle manufactured in another factory thousands of miles away. To put this into perspective, this was an extraordinary achievement. The rifles were complex. Each one contained hundreds of components, many of them machined precisely. The gas operating system alone required exact timing. And yet, American industry had managed to produce more than 5 million of these complex weapons in less than a decade. No other nation had achieved anything remotely similar. General George S. Patton understood what Garand's rifle meant. Patton called it the greatest battle implement ever devised. This was not casual praise. Patton was perhaps the most experienced American field commander of the war. He had seen American soldiers armed with the M1 Garand face German soldiers armed with the Kar 98K, a bolt-action rifle that was reliable, accurate, and respectable, but not semi-automatic. Patton understood that the difference was not marginal. It was fundamental. When American and German infantry units clashed, the difference in firepower was overwhelming. An American rifle squad of 8 men armed with M1 Garands could generate approximately 320 to 400 rounds per minute of aimed fire. A German rifle squad of 8 men armed with Kar 98K rifles could generate perhaps 100 to 150 rounds per minute. The American squad could deliver 4 times as much firepower. in the hedgerow fighting of Normandy after D-Day, in the urban combat of European cities, in the island campaigns of the Pacific, the semi-automatic M1 Garand provided American soldiers with a decisive advantage. Captured German officers acknowledged this openly after the war. General Emil Lieb, a Wehrmacht weapons inspector, stated, "We focused on complicated wonder weapons, rockets, jets, supertanks, while ignoring basic infantry needs. We developed the world's first assault rifle but couldn't produce enough of them. Meanwhile, Americans gave every soldier a semi-automatic rifle and buried us under superior firepower." But the German frustration reflected something even deeper than the mere fact of superior firepower. German intelligence officers who examined captured M1 rifles were astounded by something else entirely: the precision with which they were manufactured at such massive scale. A captured Wehrmacht report from 1944, preserved in British military archives, stated, "The M1 rifle demonstrates mass production techniques we cannot replicate. Components show precise tolerances maintained across thousands of examples. Interchangeability of parts is achieved at scales we have not encountered in our industry." This was the real victory. Not the rifle itself, though the rifle was superb, but the manufacturing system. The philosophy that said, "We will design this weapon so that it can be manufactured reliably by semi-skilled workers using machine tools operating at industrial scale. We will standardize components. We will work backward from the manufacturing capability available to us, rather than designing weapons that exceed what our factories can produce. We will accept tolerances that are good enough, rather than demanding perfection." The German approach was different. German rifles were handcrafted. Precision was paramount. German factories produced weapons of exceptional quality, but they could not produce them in quantities that matched American production. By the time Germany attempted to shift to mass production manufacturing techniques during the later years of the war, it was too late. The industrial momentum had already shifted completely in America's favor. John Garand did not profit from his invention. He was a government employee, and by the time the M1 was adopted by the Army, all his patents related to it had been assigned to the government without royalty compensation. Congress attempted to award him $100,000 in recognition of his contribution to the war effort, but the bill never passed. Garand continued working at Springfield Armory until his retirement in 1953, after 34 years of service. He had held 54 firearms-related patents. All had been assigned to the government without additional compensation. He lived modestly in Springfield, Massachusetts. When he was interviewed in the 1940s, Garand said, "I am not a genius. I am just a mechanic who loves to solve problems. The M1 rifle was simply a problem that needed solving. How to give our soldiers the best possible weapon. If my rifle saved even one American life, then my work was worthwhile." This statement reveals something essential about the man and the moment. Garand's perspective was not that of someone seeking fortune or fame. It was the perspective of someone who understood that his task was to solve a technical problem. The problem was, how do you give soldiers a weapon that gives them a decisive advantage while still being able to manufacture it in the quantities that modern warfare demands? The problem had layers. First, the rifle itself had to be designed correctly. It had to be reliable. It had to be accurate. It had to have a high rate of fire. It had to be relatively easy to maintain. All of these requirements had to be satisfied simultaneously. Garand's design solved this. Second, the rifle had to be capable of being manufactured at massive scale. The early designs, the competition with other designers, the constant refinement, all of this was Garand trying to arrive at a design that could actually be produced in quantity. By the time the M1 was officially adopted in 1936, the design had already been optimized for manufacturing. Then came the third problem, actually, building the factories and training the workers and establishing the supply chains and the quality control systems necessary to produce millions of rifles reliably. This problem took the entire period from 1937 to 1945 to solve. It required not just Garand, but thousands of engineers, workers, managers, and military officials working together. But Garand was the center of this effort. He worked continuously with production engineers to refine manufacturing processes. He identified problems and proposed solutions. He understood that the success of the entire war effort depended in part on whether American industry could deliver what the military planners had promised. Millions of semi-automatic rifles that would work reliably in every combat environment. The rifles did work reliably. The Marines who fought at Guadalcanal in 1942, the infantrymen who waited ashore at Normandy in 1944, the soldiers who fought through the Pacific Island campaigns, all of them carried M1 Garands. The rifles jammed sometimes. Rifles always jam sometimes. But the rate of failure was remarkably low. American soldiers developed faith in their weapons. German soldiers developed fear of them. Japanese soldiers, when captured, often marveled at the semi-automatic capability of American rifles. What made this achievement even more remarkable was that it was accomplished during the Great Depression and then during a global war that consumed resources at unprecedented rates. The factories that manufactured M1 rifles had to compete for resources with factories producing aircraft, tanks, artillery, ammunition, and every other weapon of war. Yet the production of M1 rifles never fell short of military requirements. There was always another rifle available when one was damaged or lost. This reliability of supply had a psychological impact that cannot be measured in statistics. An American soldier who lost his rifle or had it damaged could request another one, and within days or even hours, another rifle would arrive. The system assumed replacement, not repair. The system assumed abundance, not scarcity. German soldiers, by contrast, operated in an economy of scarcity. A rifle damaged in combat might take months to repair. Spare parts were precious. The philosophies embedded in the production systems of the two sides reflected something deeper than mere military logistics. They reflected different assumptions about what was possible, what was acceptable, what was worth pursuing. For John Garand, the war was the fulfillment of his life's work. His rifle armed 6 million soldiers. It gave them a decisive advantage in firepower. It contributed to the victory, and he never profited from it. When he died in 1974 at the age of 86, his obituary noted that he had been the designer of the M1 Garand. That was sufficient. His name had become synonymous with the rifle. The rifle had become synonymous with American military power.
He did not need anything more. But the story of John Garand is actually the story of something larger than one man's invention.
It is the story of an immigrant boy who came from poverty, who learned through observation and work, who developed expertise through dedication, who solved a technical problem that many thought was impossible to solve, and who then participated in the greatest manufacturing achievement in human history, up to that point. It is the story of how American industrial capacity, directed toward a specific purpose and designed from the ground up for mass production, could achieve something that no other nation could match. The British offered the Lee Enfield rifle, which was semi-automatic in some variants and could be operated very rapidly by highly trained soldiers. The Soviets used bolt-action Mosin Nagant rifles. The Germans used bolt-action Kar 98K rifles and later attempted to introduce semi-automatic rifles when they finally grasped that they were necessary. The Japanese used bolt-action Arisaka rifles. Only the United States equipped every rifleman in its army with a standard-issue semi-automatic rifle. This was not an accident. It was the result of decision-making that went back to the 1920s, when the Army first recognized the need for such a weapon. It was the result of John Garand's determination to solve the technical problem. It was the result of American industrial capacity being directed toward solving this problem at scale. The M1 Garand, therefore, represents something more than a superior weapon. It represents the philosophical approach of American industry to the problem of arming soldiers in modern warfare. The approach was, give every soldier the best weapon possible, manufacture it in the quantity needed, accept the costs and complexity necessary to achieve this. Other nations made different calculations. They prioritized the development of other weapons, tanks, aircraft, artillery. They attempted to give their soldiers rifles that were adequate, that were reliable, that would work. The M1 Garand represented an American decision to ask not whether a semi-automatic rifle for every soldier was necessary, but whether it was possible, and if it was possible to do it. John Garand, the boy who swept floors in a textile mill, who learned precision manufacturing at Brown & Sharp, who was offered a position at Springfield Armory, because a military official recognized his talent, answered that question in the affirmative. He designed a rifle that could be mass-produced. He worked with American industry to achieve that mass production at scales that exceeded what anyone had believed possible. And when the war came, 6 million American soldiers carried his rifle into combat and brought home victory. The M1 Garand became, in the years after the war, a symbol of American military power. Soviet leaders studied it. European designers attempted to copy it. American allies requested it. The rifle served not just in World War II, but in the Korean War and even in the Vietnam War. Decades after the war, after the M1 had been replaced by more modern rifles, military honor guards and ceremonial units continued to use the M1 Garand because the rifle had become part of American military heritage. John Garand's legacy is not that he designed a better rifle than his competitors. It is that he designed a rifle that could be manufactured in quantities that exceeded what anyone thought possible, at quality levels that exceeded what anyone thought could be maintained while manufacturing at such scale, using manufacturing techniques that became the model for industrial production in the post-war period. German companies that rebuilt their industries after 1945 studied American manufacturing techniques learned during the production of the M1 Garand. The standardization, the emphasis on interchangeable parts, the focus on enabling mass production through thoughtful design, all of these principles became the foundation of West German industrial success in the decades that followed. The boy who swept floors in a textile mill in Connecticut had changed the world. Not through genius, though he was intelligent. Not through luck, though he had some. But through the simple determination to understand how things worked and to solve problems when they appeared. He had built a rifle that worked. He had helped build the manufacturing systems that produced millions of them. He had contributed, in this way, to the victory that reshaped global politics and history.